Okay, this lesson here is all about markets and equilibrium. And markets are a combination of really the first two lessons from this unit, demand and supply. And so we're going to start with a definition of a market. And actually, we mentioned this at the very beginning of this module, but we're going to mention it again now. A market is a group of buyers and sellers of a particular good or service. So sometimes markets even become places, right? If we go to the store, we sometimes call stores markets. And what happens at stores? Buyers, we call them demanders, and sellers, we call them suppliers, come together to sell goods and services, right? So again, remember, buyers determine demand, sellers determine supply, and together they make what we call a market. Now, as we go through this just a little bit, we want to remember that ultimately buyers and demanders are, sellers and buyers, or suppliers and demanders, are their own separate entities. They do their own thing. However, at some point they come together in this place called the market. And at some point, not only do they come together, but they come to a point where they agree on a price and a quantity. And that's a very, very good point for economists. That point is called equilibrium, which is, as the definition says, a situation in which the price has reached the level where the quantity supply equals the quantity demand. In other words, at a certain price, demanders are willing to buy a certain good, and at that same price, suppliers are willing to supply that same amount. Everyone, in other words, is happy at the point of equilibrium, both the demanders and the suppliers. And that's why all markets function best. Well, not all markets that are working properly function best when they are at equilibrium. So equilibrium is a very important concept. If we take a look here at our demand and supply schedules, these are the ones that we used, or very similar anyway, to the ones that we used in the first two modules. You'll take a look here, you'll notice that just as we learned already, the law of demand applies to the demand schedule. As the price increases, the quantity they're demanding decreases. And on the supply side, as the price increases, the quantity they're supplying increases. But there is a point at which they both agree. And in fact, if you take a look here, you'll notice that it happens to be at $2. At $2, the demanders want to purchase 7 goods, and the suppliers want to sell 7 goods. At that point, it seems like we should be able to make a deal, and that's where the market, everyone in the market, is happy, at $2 and a quantity of 7. And there you go. Let's take a look at this graphically. So again, just as we've done in the past here, we have the price of the good on the y-axis, the quantity of the good on the x-axis. And now we're going to start putting things together. First, we're going to draw in our supply curve. And there it is. Obviously, it's upward sloping because of the law of supply. Now we're going to draw in our demand curve. You'll notice that they seem to do something in the middle. They seem to cross. And as we learned a minute ago, that point, based on the tables we saw just a second ago, was $2 for ice cream, 7 pieces, or 7 containers of ice cream. At that moment, both sides are happy. That point right there is called market equilibrium. And again, assuming the market is working correctly, that's where the market always wants to be. And if we leave it alone, we'll naturally end up there. By the way, we should also mention that we sometimes break up the equilibrium concept into both of its parts, right? Equilibrium quantity is the quantity at which equilibrium occurs. The equilibrium price is the price at which equilibrium occurs. Okay, we're going to start taking a look now at what happens when equilibrium changes, when we move the equilibrium from one place to another. And there's a couple of steps to kind of think about. The first one is you want to decide whether the event shifts supply or shifts demand. Now, we very quickly skipped over, very briefly mentioned, in the first two modules what actually causes supply to change and what causes demand to change, because really that's a microeconomics topic and we're just not going to spend much time on it. Just generically though, one way to think about it is, for demand, what could be happening to make somebody want this thing more or less, other than, of course, price, right? Because we know price only moves us on the demand curve. It doesn't actually move the demand curve. So what other than price could cause us to want this good more or less? From the supply side, what we usually think about is what's going to make it easier, cheaper, to produce this good. So if it's easier and cheaper to produce the good, then the supply curve is going to shift to the right. You really don't have to get too worried about any of actually what I just said. It's just kind of a generic idea. But first thing you want to do is figure out, are you shifting supply or demand or both? Once you know that, you're going to decide which direction they're going. Are they going to the left, increasing, or going to the right, decreasing? And then lastly, using our diagram, we're going to see how that change affects the equilibrium price and quantity. Okay, and here's, I think, again, with pictures will be the easiest way to understand what we're talking about. Let's start with an increase in demand. And I would take the time here to draw each of these graphs and to make a clean graph. We're going to do 4 in a row here, make a nice clean graph and draw each one independently, because we're going to have to get very comfortable with what happens when each of these changes occur. Okay, so here's our supply curve, here's our demand curve. We've labeled this demand curve D1 because we're actually going to move it. Now look at what the heading says. It says an increase in demand affecting equilibrium. So remember, an increase in demand is a shift to the right of demand. Excuse me. So there's our original equilibrium. So which direction are we going to move our demand curve? We are going to move it to the right. There we go. Now notice what's happened because we've moved our demand curve to the right. Look what's happened first to the new price. Price seems to have risen from $2 to $2.50. And quantity has increased from 7 to 10. That kind of makes sense, doesn't it? If there's an increase in demand, people are willing to pay more for the good, 2 to 250. And of course, if there's an increase in demand, there will be more goods that people will want to buy. So in this case, not in this case, in every time that there is a demand increase, there'll be an increase in price and an increase in quantity. And that is very, very important to note. Now we're going to do the opposite. Okay, now feel free, if you need to stop the video for just a second and stay on the other graph, or back up a few seconds if you want to take a minute to draw your graph out nice and neatly in your notebook. Okay, let's move on to another version of demand, which would be a decrease in demand. All right, again, here's our market, supply and demand. Of course, we've already labeled our price axis and our quantity on the x-axis. The original equilibrium, we might remember, is $2 and 7 quantity. There it is. And what's going to happen now? We're going to decrease our demand. It's going to shift to the left. Now, as it shifts to the left, what we're going to notice is something interesting. That my new equilibrium is at a lower price and a lower quantity. And again, I think that makes sense as well. As it shifts to the left, what are we going to find? We're going to find that demand is decreasing. People don't want it as much. So it's not as easy for suppliers to charge a higher price. So it has to come down. And of course, if they don't want it as much, they're going to buy less of them. So it's going to decrease from 7 to 5. Again, the exact numbers aren't the point. It's the direction we're really concerned about. We need to know that as demand shifts to the left or decreases, prices will decrease and quantity will decrease. Okay, let's move on to supply now. And again, feel free to stop anywhere you need to. All right, we'll begin this example of a supply decrease with our market. Again, a supply and demand curve. Our original equilibrium was $2 and a quantity of 7. Now, this is going to be a decrease in supply. Notice what a decrease in supply looks like. It's a shift to the left, just like a decrease in demand is a shift to the left. Somebody who's not looking real closely might think that this is actually an increase in supply because it sort of looks like the supply curve is moving in an upward direction. That's why I very often encourage my students not to use the word up when they're describing a shift in supply or demand. I always say shift to the left or a decrease. Never say up or down or any of that because it is a little confusing. This is definitely a decrease. What's happening? Supply is shifting to the left, which means that at every single price, they're now willing to supply a lesser quantity. So let's take a look. What's happened? The price, because supply has decreased, has increased. And the quantity has decreased. And I think that makes sense. If you think about things that are very, very rare, maybe we could think of rare jewelry or rare diamonds. Part of the reason the price keeps going up or is expensive is because there aren't very many of them. And of course, the quantity that's going to be sold is going to decrease because there is lesser supply of it. There's not as many of them. So I think if you think of it that way, it really makes sense. The opposite's also true as we look at our last situation. And again, feel free to stop and chart your graphs if you need to. Here's one more time, our market. There it is again. I know we're getting very used to seeing this market. Okay, what does the supply increase look like? Well, it looks something like this. A shift to the right of the supply curve. And what happens when supply increases? The price decreases and the quantity increases. And again, if you think about that, what in this world has a very inexpensive price? If you think about, I don't know, sand. Sand's pretty inexpensive. Why is sand pretty inexpensive? Because there's lots and lots and lots of it. The price continues to decrease and the quantity increases. Okay. Here's a little table that summarizes all of this. Now, it gets a little bit confusing, but I want to take a look at each one individually. Let's start with what we just talked about. Well, obviously, if there's no change in supply and no change in demand, then there would be no change in price and quantity. Let's go across the top row. If there's no change in demand, hold demand the way it is, then as we just learned, an increase in supply will mean prices increase and quantity increase. And if there's a decrease in supply, and again, demand isn't changing, price increases and quantity decreases. Over here, we'll go this direction. The first column. If there's no change in supply, we just learned that an increase in demand would cause prices to increase and quantity to increase. And with a decrease in demand, we've also learned if there's no change in supply, that prices will decrease and quantity will decrease. Okay? Now you'll notice these other boxes over here where you have these ambiguous statements. That gets a little bit confusing. The truth is, unless we know exactly how much supply and how much demand changes, we're not able to tell both what direction price and quantity are changing. For the purposes of this course, we're not going to get too much into that. That'd be something I might cover a little bit in microeconomics. So if you are comfortable just knowing the top row and the first column here, you should be in pretty good shape for macroeconomics. Okay, let's just wrap things up. First, let's remind ourselves, a market equilibrium is determined by where the supply and demand curves intersect, where they meet. At the equilibrium price, the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. They are the same. And because of that, at that moment, everyone is happy. And so, the behavior in buyers and sellers naturally drives markets to their equilibrium. If we leave markets alone, they're going to find their way back to equilibrium.